Imagine a ship sailing through the pitch-black waters of the Atlantic. To the naked eye, she looks like a German destroyer. She flies the Nazi battle flag. Her signalman is flashing codes in perfect German. She is sailing straight into the most heavily defended port in occupied France. But this ship is a lie. Underneath her disguise, she isn't German at all. She is an old, obsolete British destroyer on a one-way trip. And hidden deep inside her hull, encased in concrete, are 4.5 tons of high explosives. The plan? To ram this ship directly into the enemy's front door and wait. Welcome back to the Command History. Today we are looking at Operation Chariot, the greatest raid of all. This is the story of how the British Navy turned a destroyer into a massive Trojan horse, fooled the entire German coastal defense network, and pulled off the most spectacular prank in the history of warfare. And the best part? The German officers didn't realize they had lost until they were standing right on top of the bomb. To understand why anyone would agree to this suicide mission, we have to look at the year 1942. The Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats were sinking supply ships faster than they could be built. But there was something scarier than a U-boat out there. A monster. The German battleship Tirpitz. She was the sister ship to the famous Bismarck, but heavier and deadlier. If the Tirpitz broke out into the Atlantic, she could destroy the convoys keeping Britain alive. Churchill was terrified of her. But the Tirpitz had a weakness. She was huge. If she got damaged in the Atlantic, there was only one dry dock on the entire coast of France big enough to fix her, the Normandy dock at Saint-Nazaire. The British realized something simple. They didn't have to sink the Tirpitz, they just had to break her parking spot. If they destroyed the dock at Saint-Nazaire, the Tirpitz would never dare to leave Norway. But destroying the dock was impossible. Saint-Nazaire was 6 miles up the Loire River. The banks were lined with 80 heavy gun emplacements. It was the second most heavily defended harbor in Europe. The Royal Air Force said bombing it wouldn't work. The Navy said sailing there was suicide. So, naturally, they decided to do it anyway. But they couldn't just sail in, they had to sneak in. They took an old, rusty destroyer called the HMS Campbelltown. She was actually an American ship from World War I given to the British. She was expendable. They stripped her down. They removed her guns to make her lighter. They cut her funnels at an angle to mimic the silhouette of a German Merv-class destroyer. They even gave her a German flag. But the real modification was inside. Engineers poured concrete into the bow of the ship. Inside that concrete, they packed 24 Mark VII depth charges, 4 tons of amytal, explosives. Here is the twist. This wasn't an impact bomb. They didn't want it to explode when it hit the dock. They needed the crew to escape first. So they rigged it with pencil fuses. These used acid to eat through a wire. Once the wire snapped, boom. They set the timers for 8 hours after impact. The plan was simple. Sail up the river in disguise, bluff past the guards, ram the dock gate at full speed, get the crew off, and leave the Germans with a ticking bomb they didn't know existed. On the night of March 28, 1942, the convoy approached the river. The Campbelltown, followed by a small fleet of wooden motor launches carrying commandos. At 2:20 a.m., the German searchlights snapped on. Suddenly, the Campbelltown was illuminated. The German shore batteries prepared to fire. This should have been the end. But on the bridge of the Campbelltown, a signalman flashed a message in German code. He said, "Hold fire. We are friendly ships damaged by enemy action. Request permission to proceed." He even sent a signal telling the Germans to wait before firing flares. And it worked. The German gunners hesitated. They lowered their weapons. The British destroyer sailed right past the heavy guns, deeper into the trap. For several minutes, the British were sailing through the heart of the enemy base without being touched. But then the disguise failed. The Germans realized the silhouette was wrong. All hell broke loose. Every gun in the harbor opened fire. The night sky turned into a wall of tracer fire. The wooden motor launches behind the Campbelltown were being shredded, but the Campbelltown kept going. The captain, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, ordered full speed ahead. Bullets were pinging off the hull. Men were falling on the deck, but the old destroyer roared up to 19 knots. She was a burning wreck, flying a Nazi flag, aiming straight for the massive dry dock gate. At 1:34 a.m., crash! The Campbelltown slammed into the caisson, the giant steel gate of the dry dock. The ship drove 33 feet onto the gate. Her bow crumpled. She was stuck fast. They had done it. The ship was in position. The commandos stormed off the ship and into the town to destroy pumps and machinery. The fighting was brutal. Of 600 men who went on the raid, only 228 would return to England. Most were killed or captured. By dawn, the fighting was over. The Germans had won. The British commandos were dead or in handcuffs. And here is where the story gets incredible. The sun rose over Saint-Nazaire. The Germans looked at the wreckage of the Campbelltown stuck in their dock. They thought the British had failed. They thought the ship had just rammed the gate and gotten stuck. German officers climbed onto the ship. They were walking around the deck, inspecting the damage. They were taking photos. Some reports say a few even brought their girlfriends down to look at the crazy British ship. They were standing directly on top of 4 tons of explosives. Inside the ship, the acid fuses were eating through the wire. Noon came. Nothing happened. The British prisoners were being interrogated nearby. The German interrogator mocked them. He asked, "Did you really think ramming a flimsy destroyer into our dock would destroy it?" The British prisoners just smiled. They were checking their watches. The explosion was late. The acid was working slower than expected due to the cold water. 10 a.m. passed. 10:30 a.m. passed. The ship was swarming with German experts trying to figure out how to tow it away. Then, at 10:35 a.m., the wire snapped. A massive explosion ripped the harbor apart. The entire front half of the Campbelltown vanished. The giant steel dock gate, weighing hundreds of tons, was blown off its hinges and hurled into the dry dock. A tidal wave of water from the river rushed into the dock, crushing everything inside. The explosion killed nearly 360 Germans instantly, including all the officers and engineers who were inspecting the ship. Panic swept through the German ranks. They thought the British were attacking again. In the confusion, German soldiers started shooting at each other in the streets. The dry dock, the only home for the Tirpitz, was completely destroyed. It wasn't just damaged, it was obliterated. The wreck of the Campbelltown remained wedged in that gate for the rest of the war. The dock wasn't repaired until 1947, 2 years after the war ended. The Tirpitz never left Norway. She spent the rest of the war hiding in fjords, useless, until British bombers finally sank her. The Saint-Nazaire raid was a tragedy for the men who fought there. The losses were horrific, but strategically, it was a masterstroke. They used a disguise, a bluff, and a delayed fuse to trick the enemy into celebrating their own destruction. So, what do you think? Was this the boldest raid of World War II or a reckless suicide mission? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of deception and high explosives, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Command History. We cover the stories the textbooks leave out. See you in the next one. In the history of naval warfare, there's a rule that has stood for centuries. Big ships kill small ships. Weight, armor, and firepower are the only things that matter when the shells start flying. A battleship deletes a cruiser crushes a destroyer, and a destroyer eats a destroyer escort for breakfast. But on October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar, one small American ship decided that the laws of physics didn't apply to them. She wasn't a battleship. She wasn't even a destroyer. She was the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a tiny, mass-produced escort ship, affectionately called a tin can. She had no armor. Her guns were too small to penetrate the enemy's hulls. She was slower than the ship she was fighting. And yet, for one terrifying hour, she stood toe-to-toe with the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. She charged into the Valley of Death, not to survive, but to buy time. You've heard of the USS Johnston. You know the legend of Ernest Evans. But here is the twist. The Johnston wasn't alone. There was another ship that day that fought with such ferocity that Japanese commanders convinced themselves they were fighting a totally different class of warship. This is the story of the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. This is the last stand of the Sammy B. To understand why this battle was suicide, you have to look at the numbers. The Samuel B was part of Taffy 3, a small task unit protecting the American landing forces at Leyte Gulf. These ships were not hunters, they were shepherds. Their job was to protect slow supply ships and escort carriers from submarines. The Roberts was brand new. She'd only been in the Navy for a few months. Her crew was green. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, was a lawyer in civilian life, not a career warrior. But on the morning of October 25th, the horizon turned dark. The Japanese center force had slipped through the American defenses. We aren't talking about a raiding party. We are talking about the largest battleship in history, the Yamato, accompanied by 3 other battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and a swarm of destroyers. Captain Copeland looked through his binoculars and saw the pagoda masts of the Japanese fleet. He turned to his crew. He didn't lie to him. He got on the intercom and delivered one of the most chilling lines in American military history. He said, "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." But here is what happened next. Most commanders, faced with a fleet that outweighs them by 50 to 1, would run. They would make smoke and hide. Copeland didn't just turn to fight. He ordered flank speed. He looked at the heavy cruiser Chokai, a ship 10 times his size, and decided to punch it in the face. The Roberts accelerated to 28 knots. The engineers were pushing the boilers so hard they were risking an explosion, effectively bypassing all safety limiters. The ship began to shake violently. She was charging a heavy cruiser line. The Japanese gunners on the Chokai couldn't believe their eyes. They hesitated. Why would a tiny boat charge a heavy cruiser? Was it a trap? Was this a new American secret weapon? That hesitation was all Copeland needed. The Roberts closed the distance to just 4,000 yards, point-blank range for naval guns. She turned hard to expose her torpedo tubes. Fire! 3 Mark 15 torpedoes hissed into the water. The Roberts banked hard, retreating behind a smokescreen. The crew held their breath. Seconds ticked like hours. Boom! 1 torpedo slammed into the Chokai. It struck her stern, blowing a massive hole in the cruiser, disabling her rudder and shattering her propellers. A 1,300-ton escort had just crippled a 13,000-ton heavy cruiser. But the Roberts wasn't done, and this is where the story gets insane. Having fired her torpedoes, the Roberts was now technically toothless against heavy armor. She only had 2 5-inch guns. These guns were designed to shoot at airplanes, not armored warships. But the gunnery officer, Lieutenant Bill Burton, found a solution. He ordered the gunners to load star shells and anti-aircraft rounds. Why? Because he wasn't trying to sink them anymore. He was trying to blind them. For the next hour, the Samuel B turned into a buzzsaw. She fired over 600 rounds of ammunition. That's a shell every few seconds. They targeted the superstructure of the Japanese cruiser Chikuma. They smashed the bridge. They shredded the radar arrays. They set the Japanese gun turrets on fire. The Roberts was so close to the enemy that the Japanese battleships couldn't depress their main guns low enough to hit her. Their massive 14-inch shells were flying right over the Roberts' mast, splashing harmlessly into the sea on the other side. Here is the twist that saved lives. Because the Roberts was fighting so hard, firing so fast, and maneuvering so aggressively, the Japanese admiral assumed she was a cruiser. He ordered his fleet to switch to armor-piercing shells.
This was a mistake. When the massive Japanese shells finally did hit the Roberts, they didn't explode. The Roberts' metal skin was so thin, just 3/8 of an inch, that the armor-piercing shells passed straight through the ship without detonating. It was like shooting a sheet of paper with a sniper rifle. For 50 minutes, the Sammy B danced between the raindrops. She dodged salvo after salvo. She was a devastating nuisance, distracting the enemy from the vulnerable carriers she was sworn to protect. But luck eventually runs out. At 9 a.m., the battleship Congo found a range. 3 Mark 14 shells slammed into the Roberts. This time, they found something solid, the aft engine room. The explosion broke the Roberts' back, a hole 40 feet long on the port side. All power was lost. The gun mounts went silent. Even then, the crew didn't give up. Gunner's mate Paul H. Carr was found in the aft gun turret. He was mortally wounded, his body broken by the explosion. But when the rescue team found him, he was still trying to load the last shell into the breach. He was begging his shipmates to help him fire one last shot. He died holding that shell. This is the definition of duty. At 10:05 a.m., the Samuel B. Roberts began to sink by the stern. Captain Copeland gave the order to abandon ship. As the men jumped into the oil-slicked, shark-infested waters, they looked back. The Roberts didn't roll over. She didn't capsize. She went vertical, bow pointing at the sky, defiant to the very end. The battle was over. Taffy 3 had lost ships, but they had won the day. The Japanese fleet, battered, confused, and convinced they were facing a much larger force, turned around and retreated. The Roberts, along with the Johnston and the Whole, had bluffed the most powerful navy in the Pacific. Wait, there is one final detail you need to know. After the war, naval historians analyzed the logs of the Samuel B. Roberts. They found that in her final hour, she had fired almost her entire supply of ammunition. She had inflicted damage on a heavy cruiser that eventually led to that cruiser being scuttled. She punched so far above her weight class that she earned a nickname that sticks to this day. In the official records and the halls of the Naval Academy, the Samuel B. Roberts is known as the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. 90 men went down with the Sammy B. 120 survived. They proved that it isn't the size of the ship in the fight, but the size of the fight in the ship. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Battle off Samar, make sure you're subscribed. Next week, we're looking at the other side of the coin, a Japanese submarine that vanished without a trace. You don't want to miss that. Dismissed. November 14th, 1943. The Atlantic Ocean. The mighty battleship USS Iowa is cutting through the waves on a mission of top secrecy. On board are the most powerful men in the American military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, high-ranking admirals, and, sitting in his wheelchair on the deck, the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. They are heading to a vital conference in Tehran to meet with Churchill and Stalin. The safety of the free world is literally sitting on the deck of this one ship. Suddenly, a lookout on a nearby escort destroyer screams a warning that freezes the blood of every sailor on the bridge. "Torpedo in the water! Starboard side!" Chaos erupts. The Iowa is the target, but there are no German U-boats in sight. The torpedo isn't Nazi, it's American, and it was fired by the Iowa's own escort, a destroyer that has spent the last 24 hours terrorizing the entire fleet with a series of unbelievable disasters. This is the story of the USS William D. Porter, the ship that was cursed, clumsy, and almost changed the course of history by assassinating the president. This is the legend of the Willie D. To understand how an American warship ends up firing a live torpedo at its own commander-in-chief, we have to go back to the beginning. The USS William D. Porter, DD-1579, was a Fletcher-class destroyer. It was powerful, fast, and brand new. When she commissioned in July 1943, her crew was eager to fight. Her captain, Wilfred Walters, was a capable man. But from the very moment they set sail for their first major mission, something was wrong. The mission was critical. The porter was assigned to escort the USS Iowa across the Atlantic. Because the president was on board, strict radio silence was enforced. No radar usage that might alert the Germans. No lights at night. Just silent running. But the William D. Porter had a problem with silent. The trouble began before they even left the harbor. On the morning of departure, as the Porter was backing out of her dock in Norfolk, her anchor got snagged, but not on the seabed. It hooked the railing of the ship docked next to her, a sister destroyer. With a sickening screech of metal, the Porter didn't just scratch the paint. She ripped the railings, life rafts, and searchlights straight off the other ship. It was an embarrassing start. The captain apologized, the damage was assessed, and the Porter hurried to catch up with the convoy. The crew was humiliated. They wanted to prove they were professionals. They wanted to redeem themselves. Fate, however, had other plans. 24 hours later, the convoy is in dangerous waters, U-boat territory. The fleet is zigzagging, nerves are tight. Suddenly, boom! A massive explosion rocks the ocean. The entire convoy goes to battle stations. Destroyers turn sharply. Sonar operators scream contacts, and the Iowa prepares its massive guns. Everyone assumes a German submarine pack has ambushed them, but there are no Germans. Aboard the William D. Porter, a sailor had accidentally knocked a live depth charge off the stern. It sank, the pressure trigger activated, and it detonated. Captain Walters had to break the strict radio silence to confess to the admiral that there was no attack, just his own clumsy crew. The admiral was furious. The Porter was now the bad luck ship of the fleet. The captain promised it wouldn't happen again. He was wrong. November 14th, the morning after the explosion. The ocean is calm. To relieve the tension, the president suggests a drill. He wants to see the Iowa's anti-aircraft guns in action. Weather balloons are released, and the Iowa's gunners blast them out of the sky. FDR is delighted. Watching this from 6,000 yards away, Captain Walters on the Porter decides this is his chance to shine. He wants to show the admiral that his crew is sharp. He orders a simulated torpedo drill. The plan is simple. Aim the torpedo tubes at the Iowa, go through the firing sequence, but do not actually fire. The primers, the explosive charges that launch the torpedoes, have been removed. It is a dry run, safe, routine. The torpedo officer, Lawton Dawson, takes his station. He orders, fire 1. The crew simulates the fire. Fire 1, aye. Nothing happens. Perfect. Fire 2. Fire 2, aye. Again, nothing. Perfect. Fire 3. Fire 3, aye. Whoosh! There is a distinct, terrifying sound of compressed air, a splash, and then a white wake streaking through the water. The bridge crew freezes. They stare in horror. A live torpedo, armed and deadly, has just left the tube, and it is tracking straight for the magazine of the USS Iowa. Pandemonium erupts on the bridge of the Porter. "Captain, we fired a fish." "What do you mean, we fired?" Captain Walters looks at the stopwatch. They have less than 2 minutes before impact. He has to warn the Iowa, but he's under strict orders. Radio silence. If he breaks radio silence again, he might be court-martialed. So they try to use a signal lamp, but in the panic, the signalman gets it wrong. Instead of "torpedo incoming," he signals, "We are backing up at full speed." The torpedo is closing in. Captain Walters screams, "To hell with the radio silence! Get on the radio!" The radio man grabs the handset and shouts the code word, "Lion, Lion, come right, hard right." The Iowa radio operator is confused. "Identify yourself. Why are you breaking silence?" "Torpedo in the water. Turn, turn." On the Iowa, the alarm screams. General quarters, this is not a drill. The massive battleship begins a desperate emergency turn. The ship leans heavily. And what does the president do? His Secret Service agents pull their pistols, ready to shoot the torpedo if it breaches the water, a futile gesture. They move to wheel FDR inside to safety, but Roosevelt, a man of iron nerves, says, "No, move me to the railing. I want to see it." The torpedo streaks toward the ship. It looks like a direct hit, but thanks to the Iowa's hard turn, the torpedo misses the hull by mere yards. It detonates in the ship's wake with a massive explosion that shakes the president's teeth. The president is safe, but the William D. Porter is in deep trouble. The Iowa trains its massive 16-inch guns directly on the Porter. They think the destroyer has gone rogue. They think it's a mutiny. The admiral orders the Porter to leave the convoy immediately. Go to Bermuda, they are told, and await arrest. When the ship arrives in Bermuda, it is met with armed Marines. The entire crew is arrested. The first time in U.S. naval history, an entire ship's company is placed under arrest. Torpedo Officer Dawson eventually confessed he had forgotten to remove the primer for tube number 3. He is sentenced to hard labor, though President Roosevelt, finding the whole thing honestly quite funny, intervenes and pardons him. But the reputation of the William D. Porter was sealed. She was the pariah of the Navy. She was banished to the North Pacific, to the Aleutian Islands, far away from anything important. However, the Navy has a long memory. Even years later, when the Porter was finally transferred to the Pacific Theater near Okinawa, other ships would greet her with a cruel joke. As the Porter passed by, sailors on other vessels would shout over the loudspeakers, "Don't shoot, we're Republicans!" The curse, however, had one final act. On June 10, 1945, near Okinawa, a Japanese kamikaze pilot singled out the William D. Porter. The plane dove at the ship. The gunners on the Porter, desperate to finally do something right, filled the sky with lead. They hit the plane. The kamikaze lost control. It crashed into the ocean before it hit the ship. The crew cheered. They had survived. The curse was broken. But momentum is a cruel law of physics. The plane had crashed into the water, but it kept moving underwater. It drifted directly beneath the Porter and then exploded. The blast lifted the ship out of the water. Her back was broken. 3 hours later, the USS William D. Porter slipped beneath the waves. In a final, miraculous twist of fate, not a single sailor died in the sinking. The unlucky ship had one moment of luck at the very end. From tearing off anchors to depth charging her own admiral to firing on the president, the William D. Porter holds a unique place in naval history, a reminder that in the deadly serious business of war, there is always room for human error on a massive scale. This was the William D. Porter, the ship that couldn't shoot straight, except for that one time she aimed at the president. For more stories of naval history's strangest moments, make sure you're subscribed to Command History.
February 22, 1940. The North Sea is pitch black. A flotilla of German destroyers is cutting through the waves on a secret mission. They are the hunters. They're looking for British fishing trawlers to capture and Royal Navy destroyers to sink. But in just a few hours, 2 of these massive warships will be at the bottom of the ocean. 578 German sailors will be dead. But here's the twist that the German High Command tried to bury. There were no British battleships nearby. There were no Royal Navy submarines stalking them. There wasn't a single Allied soldier within 100 miles. The German Navy didn't lose this battle to the British. They lost it to themselves. Welcome back to the Command History. Today, we're uncovering Operation Wickinger, the disastrous night where the German Luftwaffe waged a full-scale war
against their own navy. To understand how a disaster of this magnitude happens, we have to look at the German military in 1940. You might think the Nazi war machine was a perfectly oiled engine where everyone worked together. You would be wrong. In reality, the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, and the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, hated each other. They rarely shared information, they rarely coordinated, and on this specific night, that silence would be deadly. The plan was simple. The German Navy sent out their first destroyer flotilla. This was a wolf pack of 6 powerful destroyers led by the flagship Friedrich Eckholt. Among them were the heavy hitters, the Leibrecht Maas and the Max Schulz. Their orders? Steam into the Doggerbank, intercept British fishing vessels that were acting as eyes for the Royal Navy, and sink them. But at the exact same time, the Luftwaffe had planned their own mission in the exact same area. A flight of Heinkel H-111 bombers was sent out to hunt for enemy shipping. Here is the fatal error. The Navy didn't tell the Air Force they were sailing out, and the Air Force didn't tell the Navy they were flying over. As the 6 destroyers slipped into the darkness, they weren't just sailing into enemy waters, they were sailing into a trap laid by their own side. It's 7 p.m. The sun has set. The moon is full, casting a pale light over the freezing water. The German lookouts are tense. They are scanning the horizon for British silhouettes. Suddenly, a buzz in the sky. The lookouts on the destroyer Leibrecht Maas spot a twin-engine bomber overhead. Panic ripples through the bridge. Is it the Royal Air Force? Is it a British scout? The German ships don't take any chances. They assume it's the enemy. They open fire. Anti-aircraft guns light up the night, sending tracers screaming toward the plane. Up in the cockpit of that bomber, the German pilot is confused. He sees a group of ships below. He doesn't know the German Navy is in this sector, and now those ships are shooting at him. In his mind, there is only one conclusion. If they're shooting at me, they must be British. The pilot circles back. He isn't going to let these British ships get away. He aligns his sights on the lead ship, the Leibrecht Maas. At 7:21 p.m., the first bomb drops. It slams into the Leibrecht Maas right behind the bridge. The explosion is devastating. The ship shudders. Smoke billows into the air. The ship steers out of formation, crippled. But the horror was just starting. Total chaos erupts in the German formation. Commander Berger, leading the fleet, orders the ships to scatter. But then the bomber returns for a second pass. Another hit on the Leibrecht Maas. The ship is torn apart. It snaps in two and sinks rapidly in deep water. 280 men go into the freezing Atlantic. But now, a new fear takes over. As the other destroyers maneuver to help, huge explosions rock the water. The sailors on the deck of the Max Schulz scream out a warning, "Submarine!" They're convinced they're under attack by a British U-boat. The bomber overhead, they think it's spotting for the sub. The destroyers begin zigzagging wildly, dropping depth charges, firing at shadows in the water. It's a frenzy of fear. In the middle of this panic, the destroyer Max Schulz simply vanishes. One moment it was there. The next, a massive fireball erupts. The ship is broken instantly. All hands are lost. Every single sailor on the Max Schulz dies in seconds. The remaining 4 ships are terrified. They believe they're in a kill box, surrounded by British submarines and aircraft. They abandon the survivors of the Maas. They turn around and flee for home, leaving hundreds of their comrades to freeze in the dark water. The next morning, the battered survivors limp back to port. The German High Command demands answers. Where are the British? How many submarines were there? They analyze the reports. They look at the flight logs of the Luftwaffe, and the blood drains from their faces. There were no submarines. The Max Schulz didn't get hit by a torpedo. In the panic to escape the Phantom submarine, the destroyer had sailed directly into a British minefield. And the bomber? The pilot of the Heinkel H-111 bomber reported back that he had successfully attacked and sunk a British destroyer near the Doggerbank. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together. The Luftwaffe had bombed the Leberecht Maas. The panic caused by that friendly fire drove the Max Schultz into a mine. 578 men, 2 elite destroyers, wiped out in less than an hour, and the British Navy hadn't fired a single shot. The aftermath was a massive cover-up. Hitler was furious. A court of inquiry was held, but the results were kept secret to maintain morale. It was arguably the worst case of friendly fire in naval history. It showed the fatal flaw in the Nazi war machine: arrogance. The refusal of the Air Force and Navy to talk to each other turned a routine patrol into a massacre. What do you think? Was this just bad luck or proof of incompetent leadership? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of naval disaster, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We have more stories of the hidden battles of World War II coming soon. This has been the Command History, signing off.
Next time on Command History.
Imagine for a second that you were the captain of a cruise ship. You have no armor, you have no speed. Your hull is made of thin steel that a rifle bullet could punch through. Now, imagine looking out at the horizon and seeing the most terrifying shape possible during World War II, a German pocket battleship. It is faster than you, it has guns that can vaporize your ship from 10 miles away, and it is coming right for you. Logic says you run. Logic says you surrender. Logic says you are already dead. But on November 5th, 1940, Captain Edward Fegan didn't listen to logic. He didn't run away. Instead, he did something that stunned the German Navy and rewrote the history books. He turned his floating hotel and charged directly at the battleship. This is the story of the HMS Jervis Bay, the suicide charge that saved a fleet. To understand why this battle was so insane, you have to understand the ship. The Jervis Bay was never meant to fight a war. She was an ocean liner, a passenger ship. When the war started, the British Navy was desperate for ships, so they took her, bolted 7 old guns onto her deck, and called her an armed merchant cruiser. It sounds impressive, but it wasn't. Her guns were antiques from World War I. Her fire control system was, well, human eyesight, and her top speed, a painful 15 knots. Her job was simple: escort convoy HX-84. This was a group of 37 merchant ships carrying food and fuel from Canada to Britain. If these ships didn't make it, Britain would starve. The Atlantic Ocean is a big place. The hope was that they could just slip across unnoticed, but luck was not on their side. It was late afternoon. The sun was setting. The convoy was in the middle of the ocean, thousands of miles from help. Suddenly, a lookout on the Jervis Bay spotted smoke on the horizon. It was the Admiral Scheer. This was one of Hitler's favorite ships, a pocket battleship designed to hunt convoys. It had 11-inch guns, thick armor, and radar. It was a wolf, and the convoy was a flock of sheep. The German captain, Theodor Cranke, smiled. He had hit the jackpot. 37 helpless ships huddled together. He prepared to massacre them all. He just needed to clear one little obstacle out of the way first: that old converted cruise ship. Captain Fegan on the Jervis Bay knew exactly what was happening. He looked at the battleship.
He looked at his convoy. He knew that if he ran, the Admiral Scheer would just use its speed to circle the convoy and pick off the ships one by one. Thousands of men would die. The supplies Britain needed would sink to the bottom. There was only one way to stop it. He had to buy time. He had to make the German battleship focus on him. Figen gave the order, drop smoke canisters, convoy to scatter. And then the order that shocked his crew, hard to port, steered towards the enemy. The German sailors on the Scheer couldn't believe their eyes. This little passenger ship wasn't fleeing, it was attacking. The battle began instantly. The Admiral Scheer opened fire from 10 miles away. Its massive shells roared through the air. The Jervis Bay fired back, but her guns couldn't even reach the Germans yet. She had to get closer. Figen drove the ship forward, zigzagging through the water, trying to close the distance. Boom! The first German salvo hit. It tore through the Jervis Bay's unarmored hull like paper. The radio room was destroyed. The steering gear was smashed. But they kept coming. Another hit. This one struck the bridge. Captain Figen was badly wounded. One of his arms was shattered. But here is the part that sounds like a movie, but is actually true. Captain Figen dragged himself to the aft of the bridge, bleeding out, ship burning around him. He continued to shout orders. Keep firing, keep closing the distance. He wasn't trying to win. He knew he couldn't win. He was trying to be annoying. Every minute the Scheer spent shooting at him was a minute the convoy used to escape into the darkness. For 22 minutes, the Jervis Bay absorbed hell. She was a burning wreck illuminated against the twilight sky. Finally, the guns went silent. The ship began to go down. Captain Figen went down with her. Out of 254 men, only 65 survived. But the German captain, Cranky, had a problem. By the time he finished off the Jervis Bay, the sun had set. The ocean was pitch black, and the 37 merchant ships, they had scattered in every direction. Because of that 22-minute delay, the Admiral Scheer couldn't find them. He managed to hunt down 5 ships later that night, but 32 ships escaped. Captain Figen's suicide charge saved over 30 ships and thousands of lives. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award the British Empire could give. The Jervis Bay proved that you don't need the biggest guns or the thickest armor to win a battle. Sometimes you just need the courage to sail directly into the fire. What do you think? Was this the bravest sacrifice of World War II, or was it the USS Johnston? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit subscribe for more naval history. See you in the next one.
By April 1945, the Atlantic Ocean was a graveyard. For 6 years, the German U-boat force had been the ultimate predator. They had sunk battleships. They had strangled supply lines. They were the Gray Wolves. But there is one loss in the German naval archives that doesn't fit the legend. U-1206, a cutting-edge Type 7C submarine. It wasn't destroyed by a British destroyer. It wasn't bombed by an American aircraft. It didn't hit a mine. On April 14, 1945, just weeks before the war ended, this advanced warship was sent to the bottom of the ocean by a plumber. Actually, it was worse than that. The captain of U-1206 didn't just lose his ship. He became the only commander in history to sink his own submarine by using the toilet. This is the story of the most embarrassing disaster of World War II. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the desperation of the German Navy in 1945. Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt was 27 years old. He was commanding U-1206 on its very first combat patrol. His mission was suicide,
take his boat right up to the coast of Scotland and hunt Allied convoys. But there was a problem. Allied radar was everywhere. If a U-boat surfaced to recharge its batteries or get fresh air, it was dead. The British would spot them in seconds. This meant U-boats had to stay submerged for days at a time. They had to live, eat, sleep, and use the facilities hundreds of feet underwater. And this is where the engineering gets tricky. On older submarines, the toilets, or heads, worked simply. They flushed waste directly into the ocean. But that only worked near the surface. Once you dive deep, the water pressure outside the hull is massive. If you tried to flush a standard toilet at 200 feet, the ocean would just blast the waste right back into the submarine. So usually, the crew had to store their waste in buckets until they could surface. It smelled terrible. It was unsanitary. It was miserable. But U-1206 was different. It had a secret weapon. German engineers had installed a brand new invention, the deep-water, high-pressure toilet. This system was a marvel of over-engineering. It didn't just flush. It used a series of airlocks and compressed air to force waste out of the boat, pushing it against the crushing pressure of the deep Atlantic. It sounds brilliant, but there was a catch. It was wildly complicated. Operating this toilet wasn't just a matter of pulling a handle. It required a specific sequence of opening and closing valves. First, you open the chamber. Then you close the intake. Then you pressurize the airlock. Then you open the outer valve. If you did it in the wrong order, disaster. The system was so complex that U-1206 actually had a specialist on board. One sailor was trained specifically to serve as the toilet waste disposal unit manager. Think about that. In the middle of a war, one man's job was to make sure nobody flushed the wrong way. But on April 14th, the captain decided he didn't need help. This is where history gets a little murky, but the result is indisputable. Between the captain and the engineer, a mistake was made. The wrong valve was opened while the outer hatch was arguably still unsealed. They didn't just open a pipe, they opened a hole directly to the Atlantic Ocean. A high-pressure jet of seawater blasted into the submarine. It was uncontrollable. The water pressure at that depth is roughly 90 pounds of pressure per square inch. You cannot stop it with your hands. But the water wasn't the only problem. The toilet was located directly above the submarine's massive battery banks. When seawater mixes with battery acid, it creates an immediate chemical reaction. It produces chlorine gas. Within seconds, the forward compartment wasn't just flooding, it was filling with a deadly yellow-green poison. The crew began to choke, their eyes burned, their lungs seized up. Captain Schlitt had no choice. If they stayed down, the gas would kill everyone in minutes. He gave the order, "Blow the tanks, surface, surface." The U-1206 shot to the surface like a cork. The crew scrambled out of the hatches, coughing and gasping for air, desperate to get away from the chlorine gas. But their luck had run out. They had surfaced right under the nose of the British patrols they were hiding from. Almost immediately, they were spotted. British aircraft swept in and began strafing the helpless submarine. Captain Schlitt realized the boat was lost. The chlorine gas was too thick to go back down, and the British were closing in. He ordered the crew to abandon ship and scuttle the vessel. They opened the main valves, and U-1206, the pride of the German fleet, slipped beneath the waves for the last time. Tragically, it wasn't a bloodless mistake. 4 men died during the evacuation, either from the chlorine gas or the rough seas. 46 others, including the captain, were captured and spent the rest of the war as prisoners. Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt lived till 2009. For decades, he denied that he was the one who turned the wrong valve, blaming the engineer, but the nickname followed him forever. In the brutal history of naval warfare, thousands of ships have been lost to torpedoes, mines, and storms, but only one was defeated by its own plumbing. If you enjoyed this story of engineering gone wrong, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We are digging up the most shocking command decisions of World War II every single week. This is the Command History. We'll see you on the next patrol. November 1944. The Empire of Japan is collapsing. The American Navy is closing in on the home islands. But in a secret naval yard in Yokosuka, the Japanese Navy is hiding one final, terrifying trump card. It is a shadow in the mist, a ship so massive it defies logic. It was built on the hull of a Yamato-class battleship, the strongest hull ever forged in human history. It was designed to be a floating fortress, an unsinkable island that would launch a swarm of kamikazes to wipe out the American fleet. They named her the Shinano. She was the largest aircraft carrier the world had ever seen. She was supposed to be the savior of Japan, but just 10 days, 10 short days after she was commissioned, she was at the bottom of the ocean. She didn't sink in a massive fleet battle. She wasn't destroyed by 100 dive bombers. The largest warship of World War II was killed by a single, solitary predator lurking in the dark. This is the story of hubris, panic, and the most humiliating naval disaster of the Pacific War. To understand why this disaster was so shocking, you have to understand the sheer scale of this beast. The Shinano was not a normal ship. She started her life as the third sister of the Yamato and the Musashi. We are talking about 72,000 tons of steel. Her armor belt was 8 inches thick, designed to shrug off torpedoes like they were pebbles. Her flight deck was covered in concrete and sawdust latex, strong enough to withstand the impact of a 1,000-pound bomb. The Japanese High Command was obsessed with secrecy. The shipyard was surrounded by high fences. Workers were searched. If you spoke about the Shinano, you could be executed. They believed that if they could just get this monster to the safety of the Kure Naval District, they could fit her out and turn the tide of the war. But there was a problem, a fatal problem. Time was running out. American bombers were flying over Japan daily. The Navy panicked. They ordered the Shinano to launch before she was even finished. When Captain Toshio Abe took command, he looked around his ship and saw a death trap. The watertight doors, the most important safety feature on a warship, had not been installed yet. In their place, the crew simply hung up tarps. Cables and pipes were running through open hatches. The fire pumps hadn't been tested. And the crew? They weren't sailors. They were a mix of terrified civilians and inexperienced conscripts who didn't even know how to find their way to the mess hall, let alone save the ship in an emergency. But Captain Abe had his orders. Move the ship to Kure. Do it at night. Do not stop. On November 28th, the massive iron giant slipped into the dark waters of the Pacific. She was escorted by 3 destroyers. Captain Abe was confident. He believed his ship was too fast for submarines and too thick for torpedoes. He was wrong. Miles away, sitting on the surface of the Black Ocean, was the USS Archerfish. The Archerfish was a standard American submarine, commanded by Commander Joseph Enright. He wasn't looking for history. He was on a boring patrol, looking for tankers or cargo ships. Then his radar operator shouted, "A blip, a big one." Enright looked through his binoculars. At first, he couldn't believe his eyes. He thought it was an island, but islands don't move at 20 knots. He realized he was looking at the biggest target a submarine commander had ever seen. But the Shinano was fast. The Archerfish pushed its engines to the breaking point, chasing the shadow across the waves. For hours it was a cat-and-mouse game. Enright prayed for the Japanese ship to make a mistake, and then they did. The Shinano's main bearing overheated. The massive carrier was forced to slow down to 18 knots. Captain Abe, paranoid that a wolf pack of American subs was surrounding him, began a zigzag pattern. He zigged right into the path of the archerfish. 3:17 a.m. Commander Enright screams the order. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3, fire 4. 4 torpedoes streak through the water. On board the Shinano, the lookouts scream, but it's too late. The first torpedo slams into the stern. The explosion rocks the ship. Then the second, then the third, then the fourth. The sound is deafening. Fire erupts. Steel screams as it is torn apart. But here is where the story gets truly insane. Captain Abe did nothing. He didn't slow down. He didn't order counterflooding. He believed the Shinano was invincible. He thought the torpedoes had only scratched the paint of his Yamato-class armor. He ordered the ship to keep sailing at maximum speed. This was a death sentence. By keeping the ship moving at high speed, Captain Abe was literally scooping the ocean into his own hull. Remember those missing watertight doors? The water rushed through the open hatches, smashing through the tarps, flooding compartment after compartment. The civilians panicked. They didn't know how to stop the leaks. The pumps failed. The giant ship began to list, 10 degrees, then 20. The sailors tried to climb the ladders to escape the rising water, but the ship was tilting so badly that the walls became floors. Heavy machinery broke loose, crushing men in the dark. By 10 a.m., the Shinano was listing at a hopeless angle. Captain Abe, finally realizing his arrogance had doomed them all, looked at the portrait of the emperor. He tied himself to the wheel on the bridge. At 10:59 a.m., the ocean claimed its prize. The Shinano, the largest warship ever built at that time, rolled over. As she capsized, the massive flight deck slapped the water, creating a suction that dragged hundreds of men down with her. 1,435 men died. Commander Enright, back on the Archerfish, heard the loud breaking noises through the hull. He knew he had sunk something big, but the U.S. Navy didn't believe him. They said there was no carrier that big. It was not until after the war, when the Americans found the secret Japanese files, that Enright was credited with sinking the Shinano. The Shinano was a marvel of engineering, wasted by the desperation of a losing empire. She sailed for less than 20 hours. She never launched a single plane. She never fired her guns in anger. She was the ultimate symbol of the Japanese Navy in 1944. Massive, powerful on paper, but hollow and doomed in reality. What do you think? Was it the lack of watertight doors or the arrogance of the captain that sealed her fate? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to see more stories of naval giants meeting tragic ends, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss our next deep dive. This is Command History. Dismissed.
December 1944. The United States Navy is unstoppable. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet is the most powerful armada the world has ever seen. They have crushed the Japanese Navy at Leyte Gulf. They rule the skies. They rule the ocean. They are convinced that nothing, absolutely nothing, can stand in their way. But on December 18th, the Third Fleet met an enemy they couldn't shoot, an enemy they couldn't torpedo, and an enemy that didn't care about their radar. In the span of just a few terrifying hours, this enemy would do what the Japanese Navy failed to do for years. It would swat aircraft carriers like flies. It would rip 3 destroyers in half, sending them to the bottom of the ocean. And it would kill 790 American sailors, all without firing a single shot. This is not a story about a battle against Japan. This is the story of Typhoon Cobra, the day the U.S. Navy fought Mother Nature and lost. To understand this disaster, you have to understand the mindset of the American commanders. It is late 1944. Morale is sky high. The Third Fleet is operating in the Philippine Sea, pounding Japanese airfields on Luzon. They are aggressive, they are fast, and they are led by Admiral William Bull Halsey. Halsey is a legend, a fighter. He famously said, "Hit hard, hit fast, hit often." But Halsey had a weakness. He hated waiting, and he hated running away. On December 17th, the fleet had a problem: fuel. The massive destroyers, the tin cans protecting the carriers, were running on fumes. They needed to refuel at sea from the slow-moving tankers, but the ocean was getting rough. The sky was turning a bruised, angry purple. The barometer was dropping. Now, in 1944, weather forecasting wasn't a science, it was a guessing game. There were no satellites, no computer models, just a weather officer looking at the clouds and checking the pressure. Halsey's meteorologist told him the storm was moving away. He was wrong, dead wrong. The storm wasn't moving away. It was a small, tight, vicious monster, and it was heading straight for them. Halsey had a choice. He could stop the attack operations and move the fleet to safety, or he could try to dodge the storm, refuel quickly, and keep fighting the Japanese. Halsey chose to fight. He ordered the fleet to meet the tankers the next morning. But as the sun came up on December 18th, it wasn't morning, it was twilight. The visibility dropped to 0. The wind began to scream. This wasn't just a storm, it was a tropical cyclone of historic power. Winds were clocking in at 100 miles per hour, gusts reaching 140. And here is where the disaster truly begins. The destroyers were light because they were low on fuel. A light ship in heavy waves is like a cork in a washing machine. They were bobbing violently. The captains of the destroyers begged to fill their water tanks with seawater to weigh the ships down, to make them stable. But they were ordered to wait for fuel. That order would seal their fate. By noon, the formation is broken. Communication is impossible. The ocean is no longer water. It is mountains of gray sludge rising 60, 70 feet into the air. We are talking about waves the height of a 7-story building. Imagine being on a destroyer, the USS Hull, the USS Monaghan, the USS Spence. These ships are designed to fight submarines, not hurricanes. They are rolling 50 degrees to the side, then 60 degrees. Men are walking on the walls. Furniture is bolted down, but the bolts are snapping. Radars are ripped off the masts. On the aircraft carriers, it is a horror show. Planes are tied down with steel cables on the flight decks, but the wind is so strong it snaps the steel like spaghetti. Hellcats and Avengers, planes weighing thousands of pounds, are sliding across the deck, smashing into each other and bursting into flames. On the USS Monterey, a plane smashes into a bulkhead and starts a massive fire below decks. Fighting that fire was a young lieutenant named Gerald Ford. The future president of the United States came within inches of being washed overboard. But while the carriers were fighting fires, the destroyers were fighting for their lives. The USS Spence was low on fuel, dangerously low.
This made her top-heavy. At 11 a.m., a massive wave hit her broadside. She rolled deep to the left. The water poured into her smokestacks. The lights went out. The engines died. Without power, she couldn't steer into the waves. She turned sideways into the trough. A second wave, a mountain of water, crashed down on her. The USS Spence simply vanished, capsized instantly, taking 317 men down with her. Nearby, the USS Hull was locked in a death struggle. The wind was blowing at 110 knots. The ship pinned itself on its side. The wind was actually holding the ship down against the water, like a giant hand pressing it flat. The officers screamed for everyone to abandon ship, but how do you abandon a ship in a hurricane? The hull rolled over. Most of the men were trapped inside. Those who jumped into the water were choked by oil and blinded by the spray. And finally, the USS Monaghan. A veteran ship, she had survived the attack on Pearl Harbor. She had rammed a Japanese submarine, but she couldn't fight this. She lost electrical power. Her valves jammed. She rolled over to the starboard side and sank rapidly. In the command center of the flagship, Admiral Halsey looked at his radar screen. The blips were disappearing. The storm raged for hours. When the winds finally died down the next day, the Pacific Ocean was eerily calm. The Third Fleet was scattered over thousands of miles. The damage was catastrophic. It looked like they had just fought the entire Japanese Empire. 146 aircraft were destroyed. 9 other ships were severely damaged. The cruiser USS Pittsburgh lost its entire bow. The front of the ship was just ripped off. But the human cost was the hardest to swallow. For 3 days, the survivors of the Hull, Spence, and Monaghan floated in shark-infested waters. They had no food, no water, just oil-soaked life jackets and the burning sun. The Navy launched a massive search and rescue operation. They managed to pull 93 men from the water, but 790 men were gone, swallowed by the sea. Think about that number. That is more men than the U.S. Navy lost at the Battle of Midway, and not a single enemy bullet was fired. A court of inquiry was held on board the USS Cascade. Admiral Nimitz was furious. The court found that Admiral Halsey had committed an error of judgment. They blamed his stress. They blamed his fatigue. They essentially said that the bull was too stubborn to turn away. But because Halsey was a national hero and because the war was still raging, he was not fired. He kept his command. However, the Navy learned a brutal lesson that day. They realized that no matter how big your guns are, no matter how thick your armor is, you cannot fight physics and you cannot fight the weather. After Typhoon Cobra, the U.S. Navy established new weather stations across the Pacific. This disaster is actually the reason we have modern hurricane tracking today. The wreckages of the Spence, the Hull, and the Monaghan have never been found. They sit somewhere in the deep darkness of the Philippine Sea, a silent graveyard for hundreds of men who defeated the Japanese Empire, only to be defeated by the wind. If you enjoyed this story of the hidden history of World War II, make sure to like and subscribe to Command History. We have more stories of the strange, the brave, and the forgotten coming up next. Dismissed.